Title: The Daylight Rebellion. The wind howled like a creature caught between worlds as Samuel trudged through the forest, his breath a steady mist in the cold night air. His boots crunched on the frost-covered ground, each step further away from the safety of the last village he had passed. He knew it would be a long trip before he reached the next one, and the thought weighed heavily on him. But worse than the distance, worse than the aching of his tired limbs, was the certainty that something was hunting him. Something with no intention of letting him go. A flash of movement caught his eye, and his pulse quickened. He paused, the hairs on his neck prickling. It was barely a shadow, a fleeting silhouette in the dark, but it was enough. The vampires were close. He had heard the whispers, the rumors. This stretch of wilderness had been cursed, the air thick with the taint of blood that attracted the creatures of the night. No one dared cross it without a heavily armed group. Samuel had no such group. He had only his wits and a flashlight. It had all started innocently enough. Samuel was a young man, fresh-faced and eager to make his mark in the world. His travels were meant to be a simple task: cross the region, deliver a message, and get back home. What he hadn't known was that the forest he was crossing was a vampire stronghold, a place where the cursed and immortal thrived in the darkness. His trip had turned into a desperate survival mission from the moment he stepped beyond the village borders. The flashlight, which he had purchased on a whim before leaving the village, was now his most valuable possession. It wasn't just any flashlight. The salesman, a grizzled old man with a patch over one eye, had called it a light of the dawn. He'd said it could ward off anything that feared the sun, though Samuel had thought it was just a clever sales pitch. Now, in the darkness of the cursed woods, he realized the full extent of the man's words. The flashlight was more than just a tool. It was a weapon. Every time Samuel flicked the switch, the beam of light was so intense, so pure, that it repelled the vampires. They recoiled from it like it was the sun itself, their faces twisting in fear and rage. The first time it happened, he had nearly dropped the light in surprise. But now, it was the only thing that kept him alive. He had learned, quickly, that the vampires were relentless. Their strength was unmatched by any human, and they never seemed to tire. They came at him from the shadows, their glowing eyes cutting through the night, but every time Samuel shone the light in their direction, they would vanish, retreating into the woods with snarls of frustration. But he knew it was only a matter of time before they adapted. They always did. The journey had been longer than expected, and each day the vampires grew bolder. Samuel had no choice but to keep moving, never resting in one place for too long. His food supply was running low, and his body was beginning to feel the strain. His clothes, once neat and tidy, were torn and ragged, the fabric stained with dirt, and the occasional splash of blood. His eyes, too, had begun to betray him. The lack of sleep, the constant fear, and the unrelenting pursuit had worn him thin. But he kept going. There was no other option. It was on the 7th night that things took a turn for the worse. Samuel had just crossed a wide clearing, a patch of barren land where the trees had been felled by some long-forgotten storm. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a ghostly light over the landscape, and Samuel's footfalls echoed loudly in the stillness. He paused. There was no movement, no rustling in the bushes, no flicker of shadows darting between the trees. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had managed to outrun them. But as he took another step, the ground beneath him gave way. His foot sank into the soft earth, and he stumbled forward, catching himself just in time. He looked down. The earth was riddled with deep, unnatural cracks, openings into the very heart of the forest. And within those cracks, he could see the gleam of eyes, dozens of them, vampires. They were everywhere. A low hiss came from the shadows, and Samuel's heart nearly leapt out of his chest. His flashlight, his only source of defense, was slipping from his grip. He lunged for it, barely catching it in his hand before the beam sputtered out. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Then, A sharp crack filled the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone, rushing toward him. He didn't hesitate. With a burst of adrenaline, he flicked the switch. The beam blazed into life, brighter than ever before. The vampires recoiled, their faces contorted in terror as the light burned them. But there were too many of them. Their numbers were overwhelming, and the beam, though strong, wasn't infinite. It could only hold them back for so long. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that he was trapped, surrounded, and the light was flickering. His heart pounded in his chest. He was going to die here, alone. But then something strange happened. The light, weak as it was, began to pulse, to throb with a rhythm all its own, as though it was feeding off his fear, his will to survive. The vampires hissed louder, their claws reaching for him, but they could not approach. The beam was becoming more. Desperation surged through Samuel's veins. He held the flashlight up higher, directing the beam straight into the sky. A low hum filled the air, and for a split second, the world seemed to shift. A brilliant flash of light exploded from the flashlight's lens, a burst so powerful that it lit up the entire forest, casting away every shadow in its path. And then, silence. The vampires, once powerful and terrifying, lay scattered on the ground, charred and smoldering, their bodies writhing in agony before turning to ash. Samuel, heart racing, stood in the midst of it all, the last vampire falling to the ground before vanishing completely. He had done it. He had survived. But he wasn't out of the woods just yet. With trembling hands, Samuel turned the flashlight, off, his mind racing. How long before more vampires found him? Could he make it to safety? His body ached from exhaustion, but the victory was sweet, bittersweet, knowing that the dangers of the forest would never fully fade. Still, there was something comforting in knowing he had outlasted the creatures of the night. As he trudged onward, the faintest light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Samuel looked down at the flashlight in his hand, the one that had saved his life. With a smirk, he whispered to himself, "Some say the sun never sets when you have the right flashlight. Fight darkness, fear no night. Get the flashlight that turns the tide."